This is Steve and Janice reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote much about the power of the state, particularly overreach, and one of the topics he focused on was the power of arrest. And that's what the current trial of the 6 officers charged in the death of Freddie Gray is about. An arrest and all the chaos and controversy which surrounds it, particularly in a city that has arrested hundreds of thousands of people in the past decade, many illegally. The power to arrest defines how we live. Officer Edward Nero is charged with reckless endangerment and second-degree assault and 2 other misdemeanors, mostly because prosecutors say he didn't have the legal right to arrest Gray. It's what some say is a risky and unprecedented legal strategy that could have broad implications for a city that spends more money on policing than education. So today, instead of simply recounting what happened in the courtroom thus far, we're going to explore the idea of an arrest through the lens of the case itself. We will talk to cops and lawyers and residents about the ramifications of this trial and how the outcome could change the nature of policing and our idea of how and why police can make an arrest. First, we talked to former homicide lieutenant Stephen Tabling, who worked for the Baltimore Police Department for decades. He was also a trainer who trained police about the law and how to make a legal arrest. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, so what is the root of this case? What is the legal question for a police officer in terms of making an arrest? What defines this case in the courtroom?
Well, when you're talking about this particular case, there's a classic case out of the United States Supreme Court. It's called Wardlow out of Illinois. Exactly what these officers did in a high crime area, no narcotics, and a guy taking flight from him, they had a perfect right to pursue him. It's the same thing in Wardlow. Police officers were on their way to a drug raid. Wardlow was standing back in the doorway. He made eye contact with the police. He walked out of the doorway. He kept making eye contact and he ran. Police stopped him, patted him down. Supreme Court said that was legal. That's what these officers did in that case.
Okay, but Mr. Gray was just standing on a corner. Someone looked at him, or he looked at police officers. Does that really rise to the legal level that you can pursue anybody who looks at you when you're a cop?
I think it went a little further than that. In the Wardlow case, as I said, he was standing in the doorway. He made eye contact with the police. He walked out, he made eye contact, he started to walk slow, and he ran. Mm-hmm. This is what happened. It just wasn't they looked at him. A little bit more than that.
Well, yes, he did run, but isn't it reasonable to, given what's happened with police, how brutal they've been, isn't it reasonable to want to run? Isn't it reasonable for citizens to say, well, I'm scared, I don't want to be around police? I mean, we don't have a right to run away or run down the street?
A police officer, based on his experience and training, and has articulable suspicion that a person is about to commit a crime or has committed a crime, and in this incident, they were in a high drug area. These officers were sent to that drug area, and from what I read, he was known to them, and when he took off and started running, it goes right in line with the Supreme Court said.
And so now the interesting thing is the prosecutors have stopped talking about the knife. So after they come and they get him and they detain him, what gives them the right to keep him and arrest him and put him in the back of that van after, what in that case, what makes that legally justifiable?
Well, I'm trying to understand what the state's trying to do, because the basis for that arrest was the knife after they patted him down and found a knife. I understand that they're trying to say handcuffing. There's also case law out of the state of Maryland. When you detain someone on articulable, reasonable suspicion, you can handcuff them for your protection.
But for how long?
For however long it takes you to complete your investigation.
3 hours, 4 days? I mean.
Well, no, don't get ridiculous.
Well, no, I'm asking.
You know what the court said in a Terry case. It's more reasonable to have to investigate a person on the street and being able to let them go than to take them in a police station and hold them. They said that's the theory of the Terry case.
But with all the crime that's occurred, all the unsolved murders, the low clearance rate, is it really a good use of an officer's time to be chasing people who haven't committed a crime as far as you know?
Well, you don't know if that person committed a crime. Let's go back again.
Okay.
High drug area, known person, taken flight from the police. Why were the police in that area? From what I read, they were sent there from someone in the state's attorney's office because it was a high drug area. And when this guy takes flight, and from what I read, they know him, they have a right to pursue him. They have a right to detain him.
Right, but I mean, in a city where the power to arrest has been so abused through zero tolerance, been abused, thousands and tens of thousands of illegal arrests. Why do we want to keep having people get in these situations where they seem to be chasing people? Aren't there really hardened criminals? I mean, the city has thousands of robberies and burglaries. Why aren't they going after that than chasing some guy down the street because he might have a pill on him?
Well, I don't think it's because you might have a pill. When you're talking about just chasing somebody, there's a lot of units in the police department that are out there chasing those burglars. Each unit has a responsibility. This was a unit that was responsible for drugs, and they were trying to do what the law told them to do, and now they're in court getting questioned about it.
So you really think 6 officers chasing one guy who hadn't committed an on-view crime is really like what they were told to do? That's really what policing should be?
I'm telling you that based on the law that's given to policemen, and because of the drug problems and other problems in this country, the Supreme Court of the United States, not only in the Wardlow case, but I can give you several cases where people have been chased in housing projects. This law has been held up. The police were there for a purpose of drugs, a high drug area, and I think they did what they're supposed to do.
Could the police have chased someone in Roland Park, say a rich neighborhood that wasn't a high drug neighborhood?
If I was in Roland Park and I had reasonable suspicion to believe that a person committed a crime, I don't care where I am. Just think about this. It's based on the officer's training and knowledge and past experience. It could be somebody that they've had a problem with in the past.
Okay, my name's H.J. Harris. I teach at University of Baltimore School of Law.
Okay. So, your general impression, the prosecutors are trying to prove that the officer really made what constitutes an illegal arrest, right? I mean, what do you think, how do you think the case has been prosecuted thus far?
Well, their theory is a highly technical one, and to be perfectly honest, it's a hard one for them, I think, to succeed with regard to the assaults. Remember, it's important to separate that Officer Nero is charged with an assault based on a detention that transforms into an arrest without probable cause, and then subsequently he's charged with reckless endangerment, which is based on the failure to buckle Mr. Gray into the van. And I think it's important to recognize that the terrible video that the public saw, which I think suggested to everyone that Mr. Gray had suffered some significant injuries in the course of the arrest, that is not a part of the prosecution's theory. So we're not hearing about those injuries. And the tragedy that Mr. Gray died in the van is not actually relevant to whether or not it was reckless endangerment, because of course whether or not you're ultimately injured doesn't matter. So those things, which says I think the focus of the public, are not actually critical to the charges in the case.
Well, we do know that almost of 100 arrests, maybe only 30 lead to conviction, so there are a lot of faulty arrests. Do you think there's going to be any implications from this case in terms of how police arrest people, or sort of on the case law about arrest, or just arrest itself? Is there any basis for it to be illegal?
I think there's a huge difference between what is an unlawful arrest that can expose the officer or the city to civil liability, that should mean that any evidence recovered should be suppressed, and the question of whether or not that amounts to a crime. And I think it's important to separate those things. And there's case law, even if there's a lot of discussion in this case of what were you taught at the academy, did you follow police guidelines, and it may very well be that the officer violated standard protocol, violated the directives and the guidelines, and that would mean he was negligent, which would mean he was civilly liable, but it wouldn't necessarily mean he was grossly negligent in a way that would warrant a criminal charge. And so those distinctions are important.
Well, then why would the prosecution bring this case if you think it's so flimsy?
I hesitate to sort of try and get into the head of the prosecution. So I'm going to twist your question a little bit and say a positive outcome of this case is that it would be much more difficult for an officer to suggest at this point that they don't know that they need to securely buckle a passenger into a van.
I mean, how the case turned out, prosecution versus defense, in terms of the entirety of the case?
Well, I certainly give points to the prosecution for bringing transparency to what happened to Freddie Gray at the beginning of this situation. I think usually those decisions are made behind closed doors, and the public and community knows very little We didn't get the answers to everything, though, and we certainly still don't know why Freddie Gray was arrested, nor why he wasn't protected adequately once he was inside the van.
Now, we had talked before about the implications of this case on the process of arrest in Baltimore. We know Baltimore has some of the highest number of illegal arrests, probably in any city in the country. How do you think this case will impact, particularly if the officers are found guilty, the arrest process and the legality of arrest here?
Well, if they're found guilty, it's going to send a very clear message to other officers that you really must be clear that probable cause exists at the point of taking somebody into custody. But even if there is no conviction, I think the officers in the city now know that they may themselves be placed in jeopardy if the arrest is not even a close question. In other words, if you had a blatant disregard of someone's rights and you arrested them to cover up for your own unlawful activity, there's a much greater chance that you will face criminal charges.
Well, many police officers complained about that idea. How do you feel about that, of holding officers criminally responsible for bad arrests?
You know, in our city, if you have 100 arrests, about 35 people are convicted. So clearly there's a lot of people being arrested without probable cause and unlawfully. I think we need to send a very clear message of deterrence against officers who may be arresting people because of what we call attitude arrests, that the individual didn't cooperate, that had sort of an attitude problem, and that will be cured by spending the next month in the local jail.
Can you put this case in perspective? I mean, people have criticized the prosecution for taking such a bold stance in terms of trying to prosecute an officer based on arrest. Can you put this in perspective historically?
Well, I think it's a courageous stand for a local prosecutor to bring charges against an officer and be determined to convict one or more. We don't see that happening very often because of the very close relationship between local prosecutors and local police.